Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome back to Voternomics, where politics and markets collide. This year, voters around the world have the ability to affect markets, countries and economies like never before. So we created this series to help you make sense of it all. I'm Stephanie Flanders.
I'm Adrian Wooldridge.
And I'm Allegra Stratton.
In this week's show, perhaps unsurprisingly, we are focusing on the Middle East, where the horrific loss of life and creeping escalation of the conflict between Israel and its enemies have been taking all the daily headlines this past 12 months. But beneath the surface, it's arguably the collision between politics and economics that will determine where the region heads next. And one big question coming out of all this that we're going to be talking about in various ways is how the events of the past 12 months are inflaming tensions not just in Israel, but in neighbouring countries, and whether that could produce another Arab Spring. One of our guests, Eugene Kandel, former head of the Israeli Economic Council and economic advisor to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu between 2009 and 2015. We're going to get his thoughts on Israel's economic and political trajectory, and if he still thinks there is any chance of Israel achieving its goal of being a true regional economic force, which it might well have hoped to become 18 months ago when we were talking about normalization of relations with Saudi Arabia and anything that followed from that. In a minute, we'll be getting our on-the-ground view from Bloomberg reporter Sam Dagher, who's based in Dubai and wrote a fascinating piece in the last few days about the dilemma facing Arab governments. Some of them are still prioritising those close ties with the US and Israel, but that's in the face of increasingly vocal swathes of their population who are turning towards groups and politicians that they see as standing up better to the Israeli government and defending the rights of Palestinians. We're going to get to Sam in a minute, but Adrian, one thing that struck me when we decided to focus this show on the Middle East, that often when we talk about what's happened in the last 12 months, it tends to be through the prism of things going on in our countries or other big events around the world, not least the election. We tend to talk a lot about what does it mean for Michigan and how is it potentially challenging leaders in Europe. And I don't feel like we've thought very much about what it means for the sort of underlying living standards and economic conditions of people in the Middle East, not just in Gaza, but what the future strategy is for all these countries that were hoping that they were going to draw a little bit closer to Israel.
Absolutely. And I think we tend to think about the sort of the Iranian axis of influence. We're not focusing anywhere near enough on Saudi Arabia and its economic ambitions and its extraordinary achievements, really.
And I think that's one of the things that I'm interested to talk about to Sam. It was the Saudi government that has made a very big play for economic development, and it still seems to be quite keen on having relations with Israel be part of that.
I think your opening point is right, Steph, which is the conditions for people living in these countries in the Middle East. And the conditions were ripe for the Arab Spring, which is many, many years ago. And now we have to assume that they will be even more ripe for overthrowing revolution and so on, because people are feeling even more like they don't see the economic opportunities and that the future is even less clear for them. So I think it will be fascinating to hear from Sam about the conditions on the ground. I was reporting in the Middle East in 2005, 2006, around the time of great optimism when there was lots of, the franchise and the vote being given to more people in Arab nations. So there was a great deal of optimism that then withered away when Rafiq Hariri, who was the leader in Lebanon, was assassinated. So you have these ebbs and flows in the Middle East, and it's hard to see how it's a particularly high ebb at the moment.
There's been a lot of discussion around the past year about whether the conflict potentially between Benjamin Netanyahu's personal objectives of staying in office, avoiding various court cases, and the sort of long-term interest of the country, and whether he's undermining the sort of future security of the nation in order to try and protect his position. But, of course, the corollary to that is he's undermining the economic future of Israel as well.
Absolutely. If you go back to before October the 7th, there was a very general optimistic mood around the place, and an optimistic mood which hinged partly on the fact that the Israeli economy was doing extremely well, but also on the idea that Israel could forge close relations with Saudi Arabia and other sort of economically vibrant forces in that region. It's all been modified in various significant ways now.
The Gulf nations, certainly, there isn't really a plan B. You know, they
No,
were
absolutely.
they were vesting their continued sort of global heft in part on being able to sort of assume away the Palestinian problem and build their relations with Israel. Anyway, there's loads to discuss. We should get on to someone who knows even more about it than the three of us, which is Sam Dagher. Sam, thank you very much for joining us. You cover a lot of countries in the region, just primarily Saudi Arabia, but I know that you've also been roving quite widely. And you wrote, I thought, a great story recently about the dilemma facing Israel's Arab neighbours, which we've touched on just there, but maybe just spell that out for us.
Sure. Thank you very much, Stephanie and everyone. I mean, I will start with Jordan, where I was a week ago. And I could tell you, like, Jordan literally and figuratively sits at the heart of the ever-shifting sands of the Middle East, as the U.S. Institute of Peace said in a report last month. Today, its population of 11 million, 60% of those are of Palestinian origin, including King Abdullah's wife, Queen Rania. Later this month will mark the 30th anniversary of the peace treaty between Israel and Jordan. And the bilateral aid that Jordan depends on from the U.S. is largely contingent upon maintaining this treaty. Jordan is central to this U.S. vision of a region in which Israel is integrated economically, militarily. Jordan is also reliant heavily on aid from the oil-rich countries of the region, like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And more importantly, I mean, for these countries, Jordan is actually the last piece of the puzzle in this sort of Iranian arc of influence in the Middle East, this so-called axis of resistance. It is the only country where Iran doesn't have real influence, either through the government or through militant groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon or the militias in Iraq. So it is absolutely crucial for these countries. October 7th and the aftermath has really been a huge dilemma for Jordan, because there's real pressure from the population itself to sever all ties with Israel, to renounce the treaty, to actually ask U.S. troops to leave. This is what people on the streets are demanding. And then last month, the Islamic Action Front won the most votes, parliamentary elections that were held there. It is the king that appoints the government. It's the king who actually can dissolve the parliament anytime, but he's under tremendous pressure. And we see that in the rhetoric of Jordanian leadership. You had the king of Jordan last month addressing the UN General Assembly, railing against Israel's, what he called, terror in Gaza.
At the same time as participating in that effort to prevent the Iranian missiles from getting to Israel.
100%. They say, quote, "We will not allow any alien objects to come through our borders." I mean, that's the language they use.
How sustainable is this tension between, the street on the one hand and the policy of the regime on the other hand?
It is really under pressure at the moment. And Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, are really worried about this, because they feel like there's this almost combustible mix between this rage on the street toward what's happening in Gaza and now Lebanon, coupled with real economic grievances there.
So it sounds like, Sam, everything you're suggesting would indicate a second Arab Spring. But no.
I mean, we have to be careful.
It's very straightforward to us.
It doesn't sound like it sounds like a recipe for people rising up. But I think you don't think it's that straightforward.
This is what a lot of experts are saying, and this is also what a lot of officials in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi are worried about. I spoke to people who are close to the leadership here, who meet with officials on a regular basis, and who say that it is a real concern at the moment, because again, of what I just mentioned, this mix between the real rage on the street over what's happening in Gaza and Lebanon and the rest of the region, and this also now what many are calling a reawakened consciousness towards the Palestinian cause, and also the sense among large segments of the populations across the Arab world, not just in Jordan, that we may be suspicious of Iran and its motives. We may not like a lot of these groups that Iran funds and backs, like Hezbollah and Hamas, but hey, they're the only ones standing up to Israel. I mean, that's kind of the narrative on the street. And also you've got real economic issues in countries like Jordan, where you have unemployment well over 20%, with youth unemployment alone, like around 40%, according to, I believe, World Bank figures.
I mean, you tell us, but it is not necessarily new, is it? I mean, there's been high levels of unemployment for a very long time.
Absolutely. But in terms of like how it's all of this is being seen from Abu Dhabi and Riyadh, is what this part of the world needs more than anything else is economic prosperity and development, and not democracy and free speech and resistance, which is Iran's narrative.
When we talk about the Arab Spring, I think partly of the liberal element of that, which is, the demand for democracy and free speech and rolling back sort of autocratic dictators. But isn't this new incarnation much more sort of Islamicist in its inspiration? I mean, driven much more by anger and religious fervor than any liberal elements.
Not really, because there are a lot of liberal elements, including people I've spoken to, in Jordan and elsewhere, who are saying we don't agree with the Islamists, we don't share their ideology, but again, it's this sense of this commitment to the Palestinian cause that's kind of been reawakened all over the region.
Also, going back to the Arab Spring, what's happened since then? I mean, I guess it's coming up for 14 years in December, but you've had the sort of reassertion of autocracy and authoritarian regimes. Most of the places which had previously seen more democracy, whether in Bahrain, Egypt, Tunisia, the fact the Tunisian populist leader was re-elected last week, but with not a very sort of lively democracy behind him. And then you have, those are the sort of Saudi, UAE-backed countries, but you also have Lebanon, Syria, Yemen on the Iran side. And I guess the problem is that none of them, those authoritarian regimes, have been able to deliver economically in a way to shore up support. And that has, it sort of feels like what you're saying is that all of that has just paved the way for this, because there's nothing tying the Arab street to the regime in the way that they had hoped there would be with this kind of economic success.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just, add, Stephanie, that in the countries that you mentioned that are seen as being within sort of the sphere of influence of Iran, like Lebanon, like Iraq, like Syria, like Yemen, I mean, these countries have not fared any better economically. I mean, Lebanon has faced its worst economic crisis ever. I mean, since its creation, it is a bleak picture all around.
The most expansive economic vision, of course, has come from Saudi Arabia, and that's the one that we've perhaps heard most about outside the region, because money is coming out of Saudi Arabia, but also there's these very grand schemes that Mohammed bin Salman has for the country. Is there a serious challenge out of all this for Saudi Arabia, or is the regime there really immovable?
I would say there is, and they would admit to it themselves in private conversations. I mean, people who are close to the royal court, they feel there is a real risk here, particularly, given what I just described, this kind of reawakened interest and consciousness, toward, the Palestinian cause, including in Saudi Arabia itself. And I wrote a piece in May, I believe, about how the government was over there, the security forces and the intelligence services were actually arresting people who were posting anything relating to the Israel-Hamas conflict that they do not approve of. That's their way of asserting control. But a lot of people would argue that's not sustainable, because while Vision 2030 has made a lot of progress, particularly when it comes to women unemployment, to certain social changes in Saudi Arabia. It has made tremendous progress. But, based again on some 12 trips that I've made to Saudi Arabia over the past couple of years, this vision has not reached beyond like the big cities, Riyadh and Jeddah. I mean, if you go to some of these other sort of places, it's really a mixed bag. And people do have grievances, economic grievances, even in Saudi Arabia. So the leadership is aware of that.
We have this huge event coming in the form of the American election. Can you give any sense of what impact either of the two results might have on the
just in a couple of minutes?
How is that going to play out in this region?
Oh, God. You're putting me on the spot. Okay. We know that a lot of, the leaderships in the Gulf states had enjoyed, very good and warm ties with the Trump administration. Yeah. If you remember that famous first visit to Riyadh.
The sword dance.
The sword dance, exactly. But, and here's the caveat. You had
The Secret Service is not going to let him near any swords for a while.
But the big caveat here, I mean, in terms of like Saudi Arabia's experience, during that period is like when you had, that huge attack on Saudi oil facilities, for which the Houthis and Iran were blamed. I've seen both being blamed. I mean, the Houthis are this militant group that Saudi Arabia itself was fighting directly, starting in 2014 after it seized power in Yemen, taking over the capital Sana'a. So, and back then, from a Saudi perspective, Trump did very little to respond to that, right? So that kind of made, the Saudi leadership, and also by extension, the leadership here, rethink everything and say, like, we really cannot have all our eggs in one basket and rely on the U.S. And hence, you've seen this pivot toward China and Russia, which has kind of alarmed, the Biden administration, particularly people, in the National Security Council. And that's when we saw this kind of extended hand to Saudi Arabia. We were on the cusp of this grand deal whereby, Saudi Arabia was going to get potentially, again, we don't know all the specifics, but potentially, this very solid defense pact with the United States, this agreement to develop nuclear technology, this new strategic relationship with the United States in return for normalizing ties with Israel. And all of that came to a halt.
Sam, we could do this all day. It does sound like we should probably talk to you again at the end of the year after we, or maybe the beginning of next year, when we know hopefully who won the US presidential election, who the next president's going to be, and maybe how you're feeling about that question for the region. But thank you so much for this. It was fascinating.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it. I really do hope we do it again. Thank you.
And now we can talk to Eugene Kandel in Jerusalem, previously head of the National Economic Council and economic advisor to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu between 2009 and 2015. He's been many other things, including the CEO of the startup nation Central, economics professor at Hebrew University, and the co-founder of Israel's Strategic Futures Institute. Eugene, thank you very much for joining us. Obviously, particularly in the last few days, we've focused enormously on the human and psychological cost of the past 12 months. Because of the focus of this podcast, I'm wanting to ask you, how costly has this period been for Israel's economy and indeed like its long-term economic model?
Well, Israeli economy is very resilient vis-a-vis military conflict. If you look at the Israeli history of, let's say, stock market or exchange rates or growth statistics, and you look at annual statistics, you would not know that Israel had several wars, whether it's in 2006, 2012, 2014. You would barely detect even the global financial crisis. So the economy is very resilient. But at the same time, this war is different from the previous military experiences that Israel had, because it's much longer. It's probably the longest war that we ever had. It is much more difficult because we have to fight on multiple fronts. And so the cost of this war is significant for the economy going forward. And we will have to figure out how to deal with it.
I hear what you say about the resilience of the Israeli economy, which is apparent. But a lot of people have emphasized to me that it's in the periods of the relative peace, when at least there's been a sort of stable status quo in the conflict. It's in that period where Israel has really come into its own as a tech powerhouse. It's been hugely dynamic. I'm interested in how that part of the economy kind of holds on to its dynamism and how keen it is to stay in Israel in an environment when there is so much uncertainty and when so much money is being shoveled into the war effort.
Well, there are a couple of things. What you call peace period, we now understand that it was a period of build-up by our enemies to try to destroy us, which obviously failed, but it was to some extent period for us to build our capabilities, and I think we've shown them to the world in the last months of what we can do when we set our mind to it. we create the correct policies, and if we bring back the dynamism and the hope that we just need to pull together and get out of it, we can definitely do it. And the high tech will be at the forefront.
The startup community is presumably very mobile and very interlinked with Silicon Valley. It's full of people who can work anywhere in the world, but certainly in the United States. Is that a problem?
That is definitely a problem. That's a threat. So far, however, most of the community, instead of leaving, they came back from where they lived, or much of their people came back and joined the military force. And then, of course, those that live here, a lot of them were drafted into the reservist duty, and the application for the reservist duty at the beginning of the war was 120%. So 20% more people that were not even called came because they flew back from wherever they were. So we start from a strong position. The question whether we will continue with a strong position is the question of whether we can pull together as people and whether our government will create right policies that will allow the Israeli economy to grow much faster.
I want to ask you about the manpower side of things, which is, the political coalition that Netanyahu rests on is, the Orthodox community is very well represented. How do you deal with the fact that the Orthodox community doesn't, as far as I can see, take part in the military, take a big part in the economy, and is getting bigger as a percentage of the population?
It is one of the internal threats that we have to come to terms with. And the problem is not this government or that government. The problem is structural. We have a structural demographic problem of large population that decided to jump into the safety net of the welfare state together rather than individual. And unfortunately, the welfare state safety net is not designed for, 1.5 million people jumping into it together and reproducing at the record rate. So we will have to deal with that. This war made it plain and clear that the things cannot go forward as they were progressing until today. It is still, this government cannot really do much about it because it hinges on the coalition partners. But it's obvious to everybody, including the members of this the coalition, that going forward it has to change. We have to create conditions in which, on the one hand, they do not collapse economically. On the other hand, that going forward, they face the same basic conditions as they face in the UK or in the US or in Belgium, or where these populations live and thrive, and nobody forces them to be something different, yet nobody allows them to basically do whatever they want and pays, which is what we've allowed.
There was a future that was mapped out for Israel within the region a year and a half ago, say, as of a year and a half ago, which involved, we talked about it earlier in the show, normalization of relations with Saudi Arabia, deepening of the normalization treaty with the UAE, becoming a sort of a regional economic power and having a more stable future in the region because of those economic ties. Do you see any prospect of that now? And I'm wondering, or as a country, is the path being charted now entirely military, entirely about self-defense? And if so, who's going to join with Israel regionally in that?
I think you're placing these two things as contradicting each other, and I think that they actually support each other. I want to remind you that when Iran was shooting ballistic missiles on us, in April, Saudi Arabia and Jordan were shooting them down. They want friendship with us, and we want friendship with them. And the collaboration, by the way, under the table has been happening for many, many years. And the fact that Iran has been trying to, and Hamas were trying to attack us so early, is because we were very close to signing an agreement with Saudi. And so the idea was to derail it. We cannot sign an agreement with Saudis if we don't exist, if we're continuously being under threat of annihilation.
You mentioned earlier that one of the questions was about whether or not this government would be able to take the decisions and push through policies that could help strengthen the economy and the basis for that, sort of particularly that the tech sector and startup nation. Do you see this government being able to make those investments, take those decisions, or indeed do you think any government could in this kind of environment?
If you ask me whether this is the best government, best coalition for this type of scenario, I would definitely tell you that it's not. Whether you ask me whether there is anything we can do about it, the answer is no, because this is a democratically elected government which has another 2 years on its clock until it has to go to elections.
You think this government will last the full term, this coalition?
It is real.
I mean, a year ago, no one would have bet on that, so I'm interested that you say that in passing.
Well, actually, my view was that this government will survive for most of its term, even after October 7th, because there were no, legal forces that could bring it down. And the members of the coalition were definitely not interested to go to the electorate right after this disaster. Right now, I think there are two possible ways of this government going to elections. A, that one of these small right-wing parties will bring it down because it will not want to go to the elections because they haven't done anything that they promised. Or that the prime minister decides that it's a fortunate time for him because of various successes of the military to go for an election. That's what I think might happen. Otherwise, I think it will survive till the end of its term.
Eugene, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Well, that's it for this week's Voternomics from Bloomberg. Thank you for listening. This episode was hosted by me, Stephanie Flanders, with Allegra Stratton and Adrian Wooldridge. It was produced, as ever, by Summer Sadi, with production support from Chris Martlew and Isabella Ward, and sound design by Moses Andan. Brendan Francis Noonan is our executive producer, and Sage Bowman is head of podcasts, with special thanks this week to Sam Dagher and Eugene Kandel.